Eugene, what do you have for us?
Okay, so how's everyone doing? Good. Okay, well, as you can see,
Enthusiastic.
we are in the home stretch. Finals coming up. So here's my session times and my office hours. Back to business as normal. We can go on to the next one. So, only got 6 more meetings until the final. I've got a challenge for you. I would love to see 30 people who have never been to one of my sessions, and I have all the attendance rosters so I know if you've been there before. If I get 30 new people, that's a great. That would just make my semester for me. It means for whatever reason, I just like that idea. But so what's in it for you? Well, first off, every session and every office hour, if you come to see me, I'm going to have you write a test question. And if it's a good test question, I'm going to turn it into Mr. Hansen. And if Mr. Hansen likes it, he's going to put it on the final. So guess what? If you come to sessions, you have a chance to write your own test. And second, if I can meet that goal, I'm going to bring in an embarrassing photo of myself to show on the day of the final. Now, it's not going to be horribly embarrassing. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but let's just say it was a questionable fashion choice in 1991. It's even worse nowadays. So that's...
I know what it is.
It's not the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I actually got squashed on that one. So,
I still know what it is.
If you're thinking, well, that's great, Eugene, but I still can't make your sessions. If you can get you and 5 other people to come up and say, look, can we meet with you at a different time? I will work something out with you. And if we can meet that goal of 30, that's what we'll do. Sound like a plan? You guys intrigued to see what kind of embarrassing photo I have? It's not really, really bad, but you'll get a chuckle out of it. All right, so that's all I have.
All right, very good. Let's see here. What do we need to do next? Here is the distribution for exam 3 in the green. A shift towards the left, which is positive. The average was a 73, the high a 98, the low a 44. 18 A's, 27 B's, 38 C's, still 32 D's, but only 5 F's. So we're not in bad shape. I'd still like to see this D category decrease considerably on the final exam. Now, next thing here, we'll get into today's class, lecture material, Manifest Destiny. What did I just do? I just closed it. Stupid-o. There we go. Now, 2 more things. Chapter 13, Learn Smart, due tonight at midnight. Don't forget that. And you've been getting emails from the university about the online course evaluations. Please do them. Take a couple of minutes, go online and do them. The university takes them seriously, and so do I. I want your honest feedback here. You can praise me, you can damn me. I do not care which. I want your honest feedback about this course. Now, when these things end on the 17th, I'll get a report that shows who did the survey. I will not be able to see your responses. That's in a completely different database, and I won't even get that information until the middle of summer. But after they close, I'll get that list of who's completed the surveys. If your name appears on that list, I will award you 5 bonus points. Right now we're at 23% participation. If I get 100% participation, everybody gets 10 bonus points. So please go on and do that. All right. Manifest Destiny. It's interesting that Gene put up the slide that he did, because here was my question for you today. Who's cooler, Kirk or Picard? Red zone. Okay, let's see what you say. Interesting. Interesting. Okay. Correct answer, of course, is either one. That's too hard of a decision to make, I understand. And while we're here, let's go ahead and do attendance. Okay. Get to work here with Manifest Destiny. This is chapter 13. And the overall theme of this chapter is westward expansion. Now, one of the historians that you should be familiar with is a fellow named Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a small little thin book way back in 1893 called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. You don't need to know the name of the book, just remember Turner. Turner was one of America's greatest and most influential historians. Now, he was wrong about some stuff, but that doesn't mean he wasn't influential. He influenced several generations, not just of American historians, but of American citizens, about how we think of our nation. One of Turner's central points was that we had a frontier, a constantly expanding westward frontier that shaped the character of the American nation. He said it's what made us unique, what made us great. The frontier is what separated us from the Europeans. It's where we learned to govern ourselves. He called it the cradle of democracy. Now, a lot of people have taken issue with some of Turner's conclusions since he published this book, but he was right about one thing. We had a frontier, and over the course of the 19th century, it was, in fact, this constantly expanding westward frontier, westward movement. Now, when you pick this topic up here in chapter 13, though, this process that Turner describes is already long underway. Now, Turner was right. He started from the beginning and traced it out through 1893. But the textbooks rarely mentioned it in those particular terms. So let's take a look at what Turner gives us, but your textbook left out. Early expansion. First, this region we know as the Old Northwest. Whoops. Now, the Old Northwest is the present-day states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. Now, this was part of the territory we acquired from Britain at the end of the American Revolution in 1783. Remember, they gave us everything from the Appalachian Mountains west over to the Mississippi River. And this was part of it. At the time, it was known as the Old Northwest. Now, this Old Northwest is going to be significant for a couple of reasons. An American presence has dated here since the 1750s. Remember, this Ohio Valley region was the flashpoint of the French and Indian War. And so Americans, mostly fur traders, had been there since the 1750s. After it becomes American territory, Americans slowly start moving in this region, But you're not going to see large-scale migration until about 1825. Why? It's hard to get to. How do you get out to the middle of Illinois and grow stuff and get it to market? You're going to have to wait for the Erie Canal. Once the Erie Canal is in place, now this whole region is open for settlement and development. And Americans start flooding into this region. Now, the folks that are coming here are primarily coming straight west from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, from New England. And they're bringing with them this tradition of small family farms worked primarily with family labor. They're going to practice a diversified agriculture, a variety of grain crops like wheat, corn, oats, barley, and they're going to raise livestock, specifically cattle and hogs. Now, even though it's small family farms and the average land holding is anywhere between 40 and 160 acres, they're going to be, in one sense, Jefferson's yeoman farmers, producing their own needs for themselves, but they're also going to start to participate in this ever-expanding commercial agricultural market, focusing on producing surpluses for sale back east and down south. Now, the other characteristic that we see of the people going here is that there's very little racial mixture. They are overwhelmingly white, and only a handful of free blacks are coming into the Old Northwest. Now, so while it's mostly white, within that group of white, you have a great deal of ethnic diversity, though. The majority being of English descent, Anglo-Americans. But you have large numbers of Germans coming in here. You have large numbers of Scandinavians, especially from Norway and Sweden, coming in here. And so it's very ethnically mixed, but very racially, well, unmixed. Now, the Old Northwest is also going to be important for two other reasons. One, it's the subject of Jefferson's Land Ordinance of 1784 that becomes the Land Ordinance, or the Northwest Ordinance, of 1785. You can go back in your book, look at pages 170, 171 to reference this. It was back in chapter 7, where he takes square mile, 36 square mile sections and divides them up into this grid pattern. And that's how we're going to survey and then sell off this land. And that's going to be a precedent that's set for all later Western territories that the United States acquires. And the second really important thing here is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that bans slavery in the Old Northwest. No slavery allowed in the Old Northwest. Now remember, this is under these land ordinances, these Northwest ordinances, as they're collectively known, are passed under the Articles of Confederation. So again, when people say, oh, the Articles were terrible, they couldn't do anything, wrong again. They did a couple of important things here, including banning slavery. Now, we've got another region, though, that we acquire at the same time, and that's known as the Old Southwest. Now, every history textbook out there talks about the Old Northwest. Very few talk about the Old Southwest. And I'm not sure why, because it's just as important in many ways. Now, the Old Southwest is this area outlined by the black box, present-day states of Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky. Again, part of that territory that we acquired from Great Britain in 1783. But like the Old Northwest, the Old Southwest was sparsely populated by English colonists / Americans until the 1820s for two reasons. One, there's quite a few large and very powerful Indian tribes inhabiting this area, which you remember Andrew Jackson considered a national security threat, and so he had them removed. The second thing is, well, now that the Indians are gone, that leaves all that land for white people. And so whites start moving in. Now, just like you see in the Old Northwest, come on. Thank you. What you see in the Old North, this isn't going to work either, is it? There we go. People are moving pretty much straight west from Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia. Here, and they're searching primarily for new land to plant cotton. Cotton is already on the rise after 1793, as you know. And there's a huge growing world demand for it. The people moving here, again, coming pretty much straight west. Now, there's not going to be a great deal of ethnic diversity here. Immigrants from Europe are not really going to the Old Southwest. And so the white folks moving over are overwhelmingly Anglo-American. So there's very little ethnic diversity among whites, but you have a very large division between white and black. As Southerners move west, they bring their slaves with them. And here's an important consideration. The Southwest Ordinances of 1790 specifically allowed slavery in the Old Southwest. Now, this is a pattern that we've seen as early as the Constitutional Convention, trying to deal with slavery. Remember, they couldn't come to some firm agreements, and so the Constitution is a series of compromises over this issue of slavery. The delegates tried through the 3/5 clause and banning the international slave trade, things like that, to balance the interests of these two sections. Northerners got some of what they wanted, but not everything. Southerners got some of what they wanted, but not everything. Well, that set a precedent then. Once we acquired the Old Northwest and the Old Southwest, we once again, through Congress, try to balance these sectional interests. The North is free territory, and the South allows slavery. And so we see the spread of slavery then, now down into the Deep South. Now, the folks that are moving here, again, focusing primarily on plantation agriculture, growing cotton. They're also going to grow corn and raise livestock. But as we've mentioned before, because they're doubling down on cotton, the South becomes a net importer of food, primarily from the Old Northwest by the eve of the Civil War. Now, another piece of this early expansion. Now, these two occur pretty much from day one. As soon as we get our independence from England, boom, we've expanded. We've got that western frontier. In fact, the Old Northwest and the Old Southwest had doubled the size of the nation. And so Turner was right. That's one of the very basic features of 19th century American history. Boom, expansion. Then, the next piece of this comes right after that in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. Again, a story that every textbook tells you. And if you want to refresh, it's back in chapter 8, page 205, 206. President Jefferson is about 2/3 of the way through his first term, 3/4 of the way through, and he's presented with a problem. The Louisiana Territory. Now, England is still harassing us. They've never lived up to the terms of the Treaty of Paris. Of course, neither have we. But England is still harassing us, cutting off our trade. This area, remember at the end of the 7 Years' War, France was kicked out of North America. And so at the end of the 7 Years' War, at the end of the 7 Years' War, all of this east of the Mississippi, New France east of the Mississippi became English territory. New France west of the Mississippi reverted to Spanish ownership. And so it was controlled by Spain. Now, Spain on several occasions could and did close the port of New Orleans. And that was an important factor because Americans who had moved out into the old Northwest and farther out into the old Southwest were dependent on shipping their products down the Mississippi River. And if you can't get them out of the port city of New Orleans, you can't ship them to the people that want to buy it. So one of the very first major foreign policy objectives for the new American government was to gain control of New Orleans. And we tried to negotiate with the Spanish, who really weren't interested in negotiating. It was a way that they could exercise power over us. But then, about by 1800, ownership of the Louisiana Territory, that's pictured in blue there, now reverts back to France. France and England, or France and Spain, get into a war in Europe. Spain loses. Has to make concessions. So one of the things that Spain gives up is Louisiana. Remember, France had always wanted back in North America. And now Napoleon Bonaparte is Emperor of France, and he's got grand ideas. He wants to establish New France, have another presence in the New World. But he also, at the same time, wants to conquer all of Europe, build a French empire in Europe. And sadly, Napoleon realizes he can't do both at the same time. So, 1803, President Jefferson sends an agent, a secret agent, to France to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans. Jefferson offers Napoleon $5 million, an unbelievable amount of money, to purchase the city of New Orleans. That way, it's under American control. We can keep the port open. Napoleon thinks about it for a little bit and realizes a couple of things. One, these pesky Americans are already starting to move into the Louisiana Territory. He can't defend Louisiana and conquer Europe at the same time. So he makes a calculated business decision. He refuses to sell New Orleans for $5 million, but tells Jefferson's agent, I'll sell you the entire Louisiana Territory for $15 million. He needed the money. Jefferson's agent writes this back. Jefferson gets this letter and just starts slobbering all over himself. And he writes back, yes, 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 yes. And so we acquire the entire area for $15 million. It works out in 2013 equivalent dollars, 57 cents an acre. The greatest real estate deal in history. Even President Trump can't brag about something like that. So now, what we've accomplished is again, doubled the size of the nation, expanded further west. Now we occupy 2/3 of the middle half of North America. We also have full control not only of the Mississippi River, but of the Port of New Orleans. And this facilitates American commerce. Now, Jefferson does this for a couple of reasons. One, he wants this area because the English have been hinting that they're going to try to reestablish English colonies along the Gulf Coast. And he wants to block any further attempts or likelihood that England might try to colonize this region. Secondly, he wants to reward his political supporters. There's a political consideration here. Remember Jefferson's vision, a land of independent yeoman farmers. And they want rewards for voting for the Democratic Republicans, for supporting Jefferson. So Jefferson purchases all of this land, millions and millions of acres, that now can be subdivided under the Land Ordinance of 1785 and sold off cheaply to American citizens, who will probably then realize that it was the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's party, that made this possible, and they will continue to vote for the Democratic Republicans. Now, there is an issue with this. There's a constitutional issue here. Remember Jefferson, strict construction? If it's not allowed, then it's prohibited. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says the president can purchase land from a foreign country and make it part of the United States. Now, there's a process spelled out in the Constitution. The president negotiates a treaty with this foreign country and then submits that treaty to the Senate for approval. But Jefferson knows that there's enough Federalists still in the U.S. Congress in 1803 that would probably block this treaty because it appears that he's doing it to reward his political supporters, gives the Democratic Republicans a political edge. And so the Federalists almost certainly would have voted this down. So Jefferson all of a sudden adopts loose construction. It's not prohibited, so I must be allowed to do it after all. So we've got a long history of presidents who flip-flop their positions when it's convenient to them. And nobody complained, so hey, I guess it's okay. The Supreme Court never came back and said, no, Jefferson, you can't do that. So apparently it's okay. Now, the problem is, people asked Mr. Jefferson, so, Mr. President, what did you just buy? And he said, stuff. And they said, so what's out there? And he said, rocks, trees, birds, people, grass, dirt, stuff. Nobody knows. Even the Spanish don't really know. The French don't really know. So, in 1804, he commissions an Army captain, Rogers Clark, and his own personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis. Secretary was a male occupation at that time, and gives them orders to go explore the Louisiana Territory. It's the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. And so they start out along the Missouri River here. They start out along the Missouri River, and they go up all the way to the headwaters of the Missouri River at the Continental Divide, and now they don't know what to do. So they split up, and one takes a northern route, one takes a southern route, and they end up over here in the Oregon country, this area right here that's jointly claimed by England and Spain and Russia. And now that Lewis and Clark have gotten there, they lay an American claim to it, much like Columbus and the conquistadors. I claim all of this in the name of my country. So that gives the United States a claim to this region, even though it lies far outside the understood boundaries of Louisiana. Louisiana, by both the French and the Spanish, had been roughly defined as the ridgeline of the Rocky Mountains. But nobody knew for sure. So Lewis and Clark come back, they publish their findings, and it piques Americans' curiosity. Now, there's no way people can really get out there yet. But they talk about fertile land and abundant wildlife and lots of clean water and lots of forests and Indians that are relatively friendly. And it makes Americans back east think, wow, what a paradise. Can't wait to get to Louisiana. So, after we get the steamboats in 1812, and by the 1820s, then you're going to start to see some American migration out here along the Missouri River, along the Arkansas River, penetrating up these rivers to settle this area. But it's not until, well, after the Civil War, when we get railroads out here, that you really see large-scale development in this area. But now we've doubled the size of the nation again. The last piece of this early expansion is Florida. Now, Florida's a weird place then, it's a weird place now. And one of the weird things about Florida back then is nobody quite knew who owned Florida. The Spanish have claimed it since 1493. In fact, the Spanish settlement of St. Augustine is the oldest permanent settlement in the New World. But then you've got a dozen or so rather powerful Indian tribes like the Seminole, who claim it as their land. And the Spanish have never been able to fully control these Indian groups. Now, Americans have a presence there, at least from the War of 1812. Then General, later President, but then General Andrew Jackson leads an expedition, an American expedition down into Florida, but is unsuccessful at capturing it. But let's go back to a map here. Americans have an interest in Florida primarily because they want to be able to capture their runaway slaves. Slaves from the Carolinas and Georgia know that if they can make it to Florida, the Indians will give them refuge. And so American Southerners want Florida so they can capture their runaway slaves. But then American businessmen want Florida for another reason. This touchscreen is just way too sensitive. And that's not the map I wanted. Hang on. Yes, that's the map I wanted. Florida, let's say, ends right there. Now, we already own New Orleans, and we can get our shipping out into the Gulf. However, Spain still controls Cuba, which is right there. And that 90-mile wide body of water known as the Florida Straits is a choke point. The Spanish Navy can blockade either side of that and stop American commerce from getting through. And so American businessmen want us to own Florida so that we can establish navigation rights to sail through international waters. Because right now it's considered, that area is considered Spanish territory. Now, if Florida becomes an American possession, that's international waters. And if Spain tries to blockade us, that's an act of war. So, there's some fairly large support to acquire Florida. And we negotiate with Spain, but Spain is, well, let's say not really terribly willing to let go of Florida just yet. Spain wants something in return. So let's go back to Louisiana. Again, remember, nobody knows exactly what the western boundary of Louisiana is. It's very vague. It's never been actually drawn out. So in 1819, the United States and Spain negotiate the Adams-Ognjes Treaty. The Adams-Ognjes Treaty does two things. We acquire Florida. Spain gives us Florida, free of charge. In exchange, Spain wants a firm, set western boundary for Louisiana that separates the United States from Nueva España. So that they sit down and they draw a line on the map that looks roughly like that, separating Spain, New Spain, Mexico, from the United States. Spain now, at least temporarily, thinks, well, that'll keep those pesky Americans from moving any further west, encroaching into Spanish territory. Little did they know that won't last long. So now, Turner was right. We've rapidly expanded. Just in the first generation of Americans' existence as an independent nation, we've quadrupled the size of the country. And so this is a constant westward movement. Answer this for me real quick, if you don't mind. The Northwest Ordinances red zone. Okay. Survey says, let's zoom out. Survey says D. Correct answer is D. Very good. 92%. I'll accept that. Moving on. Up to now, nobody has really used the term manifest destiny. We've simply referred to these territorial acquisitions as, well, territorial acquisitions. But now this idea of a continental nation starts to return. And remember, this is not exactly a new concept. During the Revolution, the Continental Congress, the Continental Army projected this image of unity between these very diverse states full of very diverse people. It's a way to conceptualize a single nation. And now, in the 1830s, this idea is going to come back. This idea of a continental nation. Now we start to call it manifest destiny. Now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here to describe this idea that's sinking into the mindset of most, at least white Americans. That as we continue to expand westward, we expand this empire of liberty, as Jefferson called it. Now, a couple of things are going to happen in the background between the purchase of Louisiana and the actual use of manifest destiny as a term coming into widespread use. First off, you've got some ugly politics beginning in 1828. The Democratic Republicans, after Jefferson's election, had become the dominant political party. The Federalists kind of slowly faded away. They're a regional New England party, and they continue to lose influence. The Jeffersonian, the Democratic Republicans start to grow in popularity. It's called the era of good feelings. It's essentially a one-party system. But then the really ugly election of 1828 splits the party system again. And now the Democratic Republicans simply start calling themselves Democrats. This is Andrew Jackson. And then a new party emerges called the Whig Party, W-H-I-G, named after the English Whig Party. And this idea, of course, Whig ideology, we all share that along with the Republican ideology. But Jackson was such a force that his opponents called themselves the Whigs, the loyal opposition. And they were opposed primarily to Jackson and Jackson's policies, kind of like being an anti-Hamiltonian, if you will. And so the politics gets ugly. One thing that hasn't changed since the time of the Revolution, and certainly since Jefferson's first election, was a partisan media. The press, the newspapers are openly partisan. And they make no bones about supporting one political party or the other. And it gets just as ugly by the time we get into the early 1830s as it was in 1800. John O'Sullivan is a newspaper publisher who is a hardcore Democrat. And so he sees the purpose of his newspaper to convince more people to become Democrats, and two, to publicize and advocate for the Democratic Party's agenda. And the Democrats have seized on this idea of westward expansion. And the Whigs haven't abandoned this idea. They're just not as enthusiastic about it as the Democrats. So now O'Sullivan is trying to get people on board, and so he coins this term manifest destiny. And he writes an editorial in his newspaper about 1835. And don't write this down, don't memorize it. He says, "It is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and self-government entrusted to us." So let's pick this apart. This is a primary source document. This is what somebody living at the time had written. And the problem that we have with primary sources is, well, they use language and words differently than we might use them today. And so we've kind of got to work at figuring out what he's really saying here. I mean, it's smooth, it's very smooth, the prose is very nice, but he uses this term, manifest destiny. What does that mean? What does manifest mean? If something is manifest, what does that mean? You got a dictionary app right there on your smartphone. Use it. Obvious. If something is manifest, it means that it's obvious. That when, your good karma pays off, that, well, you've been living a good, clean life and you suddenly win the lottery. That's good karma, okay? That good karma, it's manifest. Something manifests itself. It becomes obvious to you. Or in a more strict sense, a ship's manifest. is the list of cargo that ship is carrying. So when the ship pulls into the port, the captain hands the port master, the revenue agent, the manifest that clearly lists everything the ship is carrying, so the tax people know what to tax and what not to tax. That's assuming we don't smuggle, of course. What is destiny? Give me another word for destiny. Fate. What's fate? It's already been done. It's preordained. It's something we have no control over, do we? It's going to happen regardless. So it's obvious that this is going to happen, and we can't do anything to stop it. Our manifest destiny, our obvious fate, is to overspread and possess the whole of the continent, which providence, give me another word for providence, God has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and self-government. He, God, entrusted to us. So we're on a mission from God here, according to O'Sullivan. What does that sound like? Have you heard something like that before? Well, even long after the Crusades. In the American colonial experience, what does this sound like? I know you haven't done a complete brain dump. Slavery. Not exactly slavery. I'll give you a hint. It starts with P. The Pope. No, not the Pope. The Puritans. The city upon the hill, Massachusetts Bay. What are we doing? We're coming over here. We're going to create this beautiful city on the hill. We're going to be the example that everybody else is going to follow. Why did the Puritans do that? Because they were given a mission from God to come over and start this perfect godly society. It's known as exceptionalism. That we Puritans, and later we Americans, are an exceptional people. God has given us a different set of rules to play by, and He expects great things from us. He expects us to lead and to usher in the earthly kingdom. Now, we've already gone through, or we're in the midst now actually by the time Sullivan writes this, we've already gone through the Second Great Awakening. And so that evangelical spirit is still very strong. And so when O'Sullivan writes this, and Americans at the time knew exactly what he was saying, they didn't have to tease out the meaning of this. They go, duh, of course, we're on a mission from God. This is what makes us unique and special. We're going to overspread and possess this so that we can build this empire of liberty, so we can demonstrate how people can govern themselves, how we can fulfill the ideals of the Declaration. And so O'Sullivan strikes a very positive note here among a broad majority of at least the white American public. And even though he's a Democrat, a lot of Whigs buy into this as well. Now, this is a little bit after the period. This painting is created in 1872 by a recent immigrant at that time from Germany, a fellow named John Gast. It's called American Progress. And this is a visual representation of exactly this whole concept of manifest destiny. Now, paintings are primary sources as well. They can tell us what people at the time were thinking, how they were responding, how they were acting, what was on their minds. Let's look at this. Let's see, what can we tease out here? Put yourself in that time period looking at this picture? Tell me what you see. Not all at once now.
Moving into unexplored
Okay,
territory.
which direction are we moving? Apparently we're moving west, because west in the United States is always represented on the left, so we're obviously moving west. Okay, moving west. What else?
There's a certain component of industrialization depicted, because you can see like the horse and buggy, but you can also see the railroads and stuff like that.
Okay. Here's the railroads back here. Now, who's this chick? She's barely wearing anything. Who's this? She's Liberty, sometimes also known as Columbia. She's this mythical female representation of America. She's kind of this American goddess. And what's she doing? She's eerily floating above all of this, because Liberty and Justice and Columbia, the three of them are all combined at times. They're goddesses. They're not concerned. They're not part of the earthly world. They're part of the spiritual realm. She's floating above all of this, guiding this. She's got the Constitution right there. And then she's got a roll of string of wire. She's stringing the telegraph along as she goes. And then first we've got the pioneers on foot moving west, and then pretty soon the wagon trains and the stagecoaches, followed by the railroads later. And as we start to settle, people start farming. Now look at how Gast used this contrast between light and darkness. What do you think he meant by that? What's symbolic there? Where's the United States? In the light. What's in the dark? The unknown, the mysterious, the perhaps devious. And as Liberty and Justice and Columbia start moving west, look what happens. The darkness starts to recede. And she brings light, enlightenment. And look what's happening to the Indians. They're getting the hell out of here as fast as they can. They're being driven back along with the darkness. And most Americans in 1872 would have seen this picture, and they instantly would have understood what this meant and what all of these symbols are. And so it tells us, well, what they were thinking. Now, take a step back chronologically. We've got an issue that's going to that's going to complicate our manifest destiny, our mission from God to overspread and possess the entire continent. And that is the slavery question. This problem of slavery comes back again in 1820. Now remember, here's the new map, we've just acquired Florida, and here, this line right here separates Spain from the United States. Oregon is a joint occupation between a couple of countries. Now, we've got that firm line, that's the Adams-Onis Treaty line. All of this was Louisiana. In 1808, Louisiana becomes the first state created out of the Louisiana Territory. By 1820, Missouri has the required 60,000 registered voters and now applies for admission as statehood. It's always best to be a state than a territory because you have more control over your local affairs. So Missouri applies for statehood as a slave state because a large number of people who've gone to Missouri have come from Tennessee and Kentucky along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. And so they apply for admission as a slave state. Northerners immediately oppose Missouri's admission. Why? Because it would upset the balance of power. Now, if Missouri comes in as a slave state, southern states, the slaveholding states, will have more representatives in the House of Representatives, more congressmen in the House, which they already enjoy an advantage because of the 3/5 clause, so it'll make them even more powerful in the House. Plus, they acquire 2 additional senators, which means that the southern states will dominate the federal government. And northerners, strictly on political grounds, not even talking about the issue of slavery, are not going to allow that to happen. And so this gets really ugly. There's talk of rebellion if Missouri is admitted as a slave state. There's talk of perhaps this could lead to a civil war that could break up the Union. Rhode Island goes so far as to say if Missouri is admitted as a slave state, we secede. We're withdrawing from the United States. We're going to have no part of this. And so things are really ugly here in 1820. Finally, 1821, they reach a compromise known as the Missouri Compromise. Again, building on the precedent that had already been set as early as the Constitutional Convention, followed up with the Northwest and Southwest ordinances. We're going to balance these sectional interests. We're going to give Northerners something that they want. We're going to give Southerners something they want. Nobody gets everything, but everybody gets something. That's the art of the compromise. Missouri will be admitted as a slave state, which would upset the balance of power in Congress. So, Maine is admitted as a free state at the same time Missouri comes in as a slave state. So now the balance of power in Congress has been restored. Neither side has a dominant advantage. Then, well, how do we deal with the rest of the Louisiana Territory? Congress decides, and let me erase this again, Congress decides that we'll draw a line along the southern border of Missouri at the 36-minute, or the 36-degree, 30-minute northern latitude line, also just known as the 3630 line. North of 3630 in Louisiana, slavery will be forever prohibited. Sounds very much like the Northwest ordinances. However, south of the 3630 line, whatever states we create out of the remaining parts of Louisiana will specifically allow slavery if the people there want it. So once this compromise has been announced, the entire country breathes this big collective sigh of relief. Civil war, rebellion, secession has been averted. Now, again, the art of the compromise, both sides think they got the best part of the deal. Northerners look at it and they say, look at all of this area that we can create maybe a dozen free states out of. So we can overwhelm the North or overwhelm the South. And then, how on earth can a Southerner look at this map and say, we got the best deal? I mean, all that's left is Arkansas? Really? What are Southerners thinking? Expansion. Where? West. Southerners simply say, look, the North is hemmed in here by Canada. Canada's not going to let the United States expand into Canada. And we don't know about Oregon yet, but it's pretty sure that, England's not going to let us have Oregon. But look at all this land we can acquire eventually from Spain. And look at the tens of dozens of slave states we could create there. What's the Southern flaw? What's the flaw in Southerners' thinking here? Write that down. What's the flaw in Southerners' expectation that they will acquire slave territory further west, south of the 3630 line? And then hold on to that thought for a little bit. I'll give you the answer in a bit. So now we've averted the latest, but certainly not the last, crisis over slavery. So let me ask you this. Which of the following here was not part of the Missouri Compromise? Which of the following is not part of the Missouri Compromise? Red zone. Okay. Survey says, it looks like everybody's pretty confident about this. And you are correct. Very good. Now, before we go any further, let's look at this one just a bit. This choice right here, D. Congress split along sectional lines rather than party lines. What we mean here is the congressmen and the senators voted on this or were concerned about this primarily as Northerners or Southerners, not as Whigs or Democrats, but as Northerners or Southerners. This is what the term we refer to as sectionalism. And sectionalism is going to become an ever increasingly important concept as we get further and further down the road. That sectionalism and loyalty to your section of the country, either the North or the South, will soon override your loyalty to the entire nation, your loyalty to your political party. So, next step on the tour here, Texas. Those of you born and raised in Texas are thinking, question.
So were people already preparing for the Civil War, or were people still thinking that it would just avoid it completely at this point?
Yeah, after the Missouri Compromise, it was like, whew, we avoided a potential civil war. Now we've got a settlement. We know how we're going to deal with this. Let's move on. Let's make money. Let's party. Whatever. Okay. So nobody's really planning or thinking that here in about 30 years, things are going to go to hell. Okay. But over that 30 years, people are going to realize things are going to hell. Okay. Does that answer your question? Okay. Next piece of the puzzle is Texas. Those of you born and raised in Texas and familiar with the Texas legend, you're thinking, oh my God, do I have to hear this again? Those of you not born and raised in Texas and not indoctrinated with the Texas myth and legend are thinking, oh my God, why do I even have to hear this? What's the big deal? Well, the answer is yes and yes. You do have to hear it because it is a big deal. And even though a lot of this is legendary and an exaggeration of what actually happened, Texas is still an important piece of this westward expansion for a couple of reasons. Now, when we start off with Texas, we've got to look at its Spanish background. This region in Nueva España is La Frontera. Here you've got the majority of Nueva España, and the Spanish consider what we today understand as Mexico to be the crown jewel. And anything really north of the Rio Grande, north of the present day, say, present day border between the U.S. and Mexico was really not that important. It was a frontier region, and it was valued mostly as a buffer zone. There's several powerful Indian tribes that live out here that, like the Comanche and the Apache. I've asked you about war games or game designers, right? Did I ever ask you about that? Okay, well, here, the Comanche are like an independent nation. They rule western Texas. And nobody can really challenge the Comanche here. The Apache, same thing a little bit further south. And the problem is that both the Apache and the Comanche, very nomadic, very mobile, will occasionally raid Mexico. And so this region, and especially Tejas, are considered a buffer zone. And it's never really critical to New Spain, except it's a place where we can fight the Indians without them actually invading Spain. So, Spain is not going to pay much attention to developing this. They'll put a little effort into it. They're going to build, along with the Catholic Church, build a number of missions along in California here, in what we today call New Mexico, and also a couple here in San Antonio, in South Texas. They're also going to create presidios, military forts, dotted along the line so that we can, the Spanish can have a place to counterattack these Indian raids, including here in the settlement of San Antonio. In fact, San Antonio is the third part of this formula, rancheros. The Spanish are going to start recruiting people to move to the La Frontera. And they will grant these Spanish citizens huge amounts of land, somewhere on the order of 4,000 to 5,000 acres per family, with the agreement that you move in here and you start developing this region, mostly as cattle ranchers, but along with the missions and the forts, your job is to protect and secure the frontier. San Antonio was founded in 1718 as one of these centers of the Rancho program. Some folks from the Canary Islands are given large tracts of land if they'll come to the San Antonio area and establish these ranches. Now, even after this, it's really not considered critical to Spanish goals in the New World. And as late as 1800, So 75 years, give or take, after San Antonio and these missions and the presidios have been founded, there's only 4,000 Spanish residents in all of this area known as Tejas. So it's very lightly populated. Now, the other thing to remember is that this area is not really self-governing. The Spanish system focuses all power down here at Mexico City. And so it's administered from Mexico City. The folks that live in Tejas don't get to make a lot of their own rules. And that's okay with them. That's what they're used to. That's how the Spanish government operates. And so it doesn't cause any problem. The only problem that it causes is clearly for the Indians that get displaced here. And that's going to be an ongoing source of trouble for the Spanish. Now, as this area starts to become developed, it starts to attract the attention of Americans. This is where Los Gringos come into the story. Go back to the map for a minute. Notice where Tejas, here in the purple, lies. Right next to, on the western boundary of Louisiana, on the southern boundary of the Arkansas Territory. And so this area, Tejas, is going to attract Americans as early as 1820. As we're going through and figuring out the Missouri Compromise, Americans are already starting to penetrate into Tejas. Now, before that, we got to go back a bit to the Mexican Revolution. 1810, Father Hidalgo posts Los Gritos on the cathedral door, much like Martin Luther had done back in 1517. Complaints that he had about the Spanish government and the Spanish church. And this starts the Mexican Revolution. And initially, we Americans supported the Mexican Revolution because we saw them as our little brown brothers and sisters. And that's what they were referred to in the media. That they were following our example of independence, of throwing off a corrupt and oppressive Catholic-controlled monarchy. They were seeking liberty and independence, self-determination, the same things we fought our revolution for. So our mission from God to be this example for other people to follow seems to be working. The Mexicans are following our lead. And this is kind of what entices some Americans to move into Tejas. Well, Spain is busy fighting this Mexican Revolution. And along the frontier, the Spanish authority quickly crumbles. And even more Americans start to move in. Now, the Spanish government by 1820 is getting a little nervous about this. There's a lot of rowdy Americans in here. And so they begin what was known as the Impresario program. An American named Moses Austin approaches the Spanish government and says, I have a solution, kind of like you did with San Antonio before. I'll bring in 200 American families. You give each family about 4,000 or 5,000 acres of land to start a ranch. You give me 65,000 acres of land for organizing all of this, and we'll come in and settle it. And the Spanish government says, fine, as long as you do three things. One, you renounce your American citizenships and become and swear loyalty to the King and Queen of Spain. In other words, become Spanish subjects. Second, you convert to the Roman Catholic faith. And third, you don't bring any slaves. And so under this program, there's a potential to bring more Americans in. Now, it gets a little bit tricky So we'll leave it right there for now. I'll see you back on Thursday. Don't forget to do your online surveys. Don't forget to do chapter 13 by tonight.